There is a moment every night when your brain stops being you. Not completely, not instantly, and not in a way you can observe directly, but in a way that is precise, consistent, and unavoidable. Because the systems that define your sense of identity during wakefulness do not remain fully active as you transition into sleep. And when those systems begin to weaken, something fundamental changes in how your mind operates, how it perceives itself, and how it constructs the experience of being you. This matters because what you recognize as your identity is not a fixed entity that persists independently of your brain's state, but a configuration that depends on specific neural processes that can be altered, reduced, or temporarily replaced without your awareness. During the day, your sense of self feels stable because your brain continuously integrates memory, perception, and attention into a coherent structure that allows you to maintain a consistent identity across time, connecting past experiences to present awareness in a way that feels continuous and reliable. However, this stability is not permanent because it relies on the ongoing activity of systems that are gradually reconfigured as you move towards sleep, reducing their ability to maintain the same level of coherence and control that defines waking consciousness. As this transition begins, the structures that anchor your identity start to loosen. Not through a sudden break, but through a gradual shift in how information is processed, how attention is directed, and how internal activity is organized, creating conditions where the sense of self becomes less stable, less defined, and more susceptible to change. You do not feel this as a loss of identity in real time, because the system responsible for recognizing that loss is part of what is being altered, making the transition appear natural and unforced. At the same time, internally generated processes begin to gain influence, allowing the brain to create experiences that are no longer strictly tied to your waking identity, but instead reflect a more fluid and adaptable form of self-representation that can shift, expand, or fragment depending on the state of the system. This is not imagination in the usual sense, but a deeper reconfiguration of how identity is constructed, where the boundaries that normally define who you are begin to dissolve. You don't notice the exact moment it happens, because the moment itself removes your ability to recognize it. This is not just about dreaming. This is about the fact that your brain can generate a version of you that is different from who you are when you are awake, and can do so without resistance, without question, and without leaving a clear trace of when the change occurred. Every night, your mind moves through this transition. Every night, your identity becomes unstable, and at a certain point, your brain no longer operates as the same you that you recognize during the day. The question is not whether this happens. The question is how far your mind can go once it is no longer anchored to who you are. Act 1. The first signs. Your identity is changing. The shift in identity does not begin at the moment you fall asleep, but earlier, in a phase where the brain is still fully active, yet already starting to reorganize the systems that maintain a stable sense of self, creating subtle changes in how thoughts are formed, how attention is directed, and how experience is interpreted, all of which gradually weaken the structure that defines who you are during wakefulness. At this stage, nothing appears dramatically different from the outside, because your body remains still. Your environment is unchanged, and your awareness may still be present. Yet internally, the framework that supports your identity is beginning to lose its stability. One of the first signs of this change is the alteration in the way thoughts are structured, as they begin to lose their clear connection to your intentional sense of self and start to move more freely, following associations that are not always aligned with your typical patterns of reasoning or decision-making. During wakefulness, your thoughts are guided by a consistent sense of identity that filters and organizes them according to your goals, memories, and sense of control. But as this system begins to weaken, thoughts become less anchored, less predictable, and less reflective of the stable you that you recognize during the day. At the same time, attention begins to lose its precision, no longer maintaining a stable focus that reinforces your connection to your environment and your internal sense of identity, allowing awareness to drift without clear direction or control. This drift does not feel like a loss of self in the moment, because the system responsible for detecting that loss is also being affected, creating a gradual shift that feels natural rather than disruptive. However, this weakening of attention plays a critical role in destabilizing identity, because without stable focus, the brain cannot maintain the same level of coherence that defines a consistent sense of self. Another important development in this phase is the reduction of executive control, which normally governs decision-making, self-reflection, and the ability to regulate thought, all of which are essential for maintaining a stable identity. As this control diminishes, the brain becomes less constrained by the structures that define your waking self, allowing internally generated processes to begin shaping experience in ways that are not fully aligned with your usual sense of who you are. Simultaneously, the brain begins to loosen the boundaries between memory, imagination, and perception, allowing elements from different sources to blend together without the same level of separation that exists during wakefulness, creating a cognitive environment where identity is no longer tied to a single, consistent framework. This blending does not yet result in a complete transformation of self, but it marks the beginning of a process in which the distinctions that define your identity start to dissolve. Time perception also begins to shift, becoming less stable and less anchored to external reference, which further contributes to the weakening of identity, as the continuity that connects your sense of self across moments begins to fragment. Without a stable sense of time, the brain has more difficulty maintaining a consistent narrative of identity, allowing the self to become more fluid and less defined. By the end of this stage, your identity has not yet been replaced, but it has been destabilized to the point where it can no longer maintain its usual structure without effort, creating the conditions necessary for a deeper transformation in which the brain will begin to construct new forms of self-representation that are no longer bound by the constraints of your waking identity, marking the beginning of a transition that will move beyond subtle change into full reconfiguration. Act T2. When your brain stops prioritizing you. As the transition deepens beyond the initial destabilization of identity, the brain begins to shift its internal priorities in a way that no longer places the stable, waking sense of self at the center of experience, not by removing it instantly, but by reducing its influence within the overall structure of cognition, allowing other processes to operate without being organized around a single, consistent identity. This matters because during wakefulness, nearly all thought, perception, and interpretation are anchored to a central you, a reference point that gives coherence to experience. And when that anchor begins to weaken, the entire structure of how experience is organized starts to change. At this stage, the brain is no longer fully committed to maintaining a unified self that filters and directs all incoming and internally generated information, and instead begins to distribute processing more broadly across different networks that do not rely on a single, stable identity to function. This redistribution does not feel like a loss of self from within the experience, because the system responsible for recognizing that loss is part of what is being deprioritized, creating a shift that occurs without direct resistance or awareness. Thought patterns become less centered around personal continuity, meaning that ideas no longer consistently reference your past, your intentions, or your sense of who you are, but instead begin to emerge more independently, shaped by associative connections rather than by a coherent identity structure. This results in thoughts that may still feel meaningful, but are no longer clearly tied to the stable version of yourself that exists during waking consciousness. Attention continues to lose its role in reinforcing identity, as it no longer consistently returns to a central point of reference, allowing awareness to drift across internal content without re-establishing a stable sense of self. Without this reinforcement, the brain does not maintain the same level of coherence that defines a unified identity, and the experience of being a single, continuous you begins to weaken further. Another critical aspect of this phase is the reduction in self-monitoring, which normally allows you to evaluate your thoughts, actions, and experiences in relation to your identity. As this monitoring decreases, the brain becomes less constrained by the need to maintain consistency with your waking self, allowing internally generated processes to operate with greater freedom. This creates a cognitive environment where the rules that define your identity are no longer strictly enforced, making it possible for new forms of self-representation to begin emerging. At the same time, memory integration becomes less tightly controlled, allowing elements from different experiences, contexts, and emotional states to combine without being organized into a single narrative that defines who you are. This loosening of memory structure further reduces the stability of identity, as the brain no longer prioritizes maintaining a consistent personal history within the ongoing experience. The sense of continuity, which normally connects your identity across time, also begins to fragment, as the brain's reduced reliance on external reference and stable temporal tracking makes it more difficult to sustain a consistent narrative of self. Without this continuity, identity becomes less about a persistent entity and more about a temporary configuration that can shift as the underlying processes change. By the end of this phase, the central role of identity within the system has been significantly reduced, creating a state where the brain is no longer organized around a single, stable you, but is instead operating in a more distributed and flexible way, setting the stage for the emergence of alternative forms of self that will no longer be constrained by the structure of your waking identity. As the central structure of identity continues to weaken, the brain does not move into a state of absence, but into one of reconfiguration, where the space left by the reduced influence of the waking self begins to be filled by internally generated representations that do not depend on a stable or continuous identity to exist. This marks the beginning of a phase in which the mind starts to construct alternative versions of self, not deliberately, but as a natural consequence of how it organizes information, when it is no longer constrained by the framework that defines who you are during the day. At this stage, the brain is still operating with access to memory, emotion, and perception, but it is no longer required to align these elements with a single, consistent identity, allowing them to combine in ways that can produce new configurations of self that may share certain characteristics with your waking identity, while differing in others. These emerging versions are not separate entities in a literal sense, but temporary constructs that arise from the brain's ability to simulate perspectives, roles, and experiences without needing to maintain continuity with your usual sense of self. Thought and perception begin to organize around these new configurations, creating experiences that feel centered and coherent within themselves, even though they are not anchored to your waking identity. This is why, in the early stages of dreaming, you may still feel like yourself, but in a way that is subtly different, as if certain aspects of your identity have shifted, expanded, or become less defined. This change is not questioned in the moment, because the systems responsible for evaluating consistency with your waking self are no longer fully active. Another important aspect of this phase is the flexibility of perspective. As the brain allows identity to shift more freely between different points of view, roles, or contexts without requiring a stable reference point to maintain continuity. This flexibility enables the mind to explore a wider range of experiences, as it is no longer limited by the constraints that normally define who you are, allowing the boundaries of identity to expand beyond their usual limits. Emotional states play a significant role in shaping these emerging versions of self, as the brain integrates affective information into the construction of identity, influencing how these temporary configurations feel and behave within the experience. This can result in versions of self that are more aligned with certain emotions, memories, or internal states, further differentiating them from your waking identity, while still maintaining a sense of coherence within the moment. The reduction of executive control continues to allow these new configurations to develop without being constrained by deliberate oversight, meaning that the brain does not actively choose to create a different version of you, but simply allows the processes that generate identity to operate under different conditions. This lack of control is essential for the transition, as it enables the brain to move beyond the limitations of a fixed identity and explore a more fluid and adaptable mode of operation. Time perception, already destabilized, contributes to this process by removing the need for identity to remain consistent across a linear sequence, allowing the brain to construct experiences where the sense of self can shift without requiring a continuous narrative to support it. This further reinforces the idea that identity is no longer anchored to a single, persistent framework. By the end of this phase, the brain has begun to actively generate alternative forms of self-representation, creating the conditions in which identity is no longer defined by a single, stable structure, but by a range of possible configurations that can emerge, change, and dissolve as the internal system continues to develop, moving closer to a state where the original sense of self will no longer be the dominant framework of experience. As the internal system continues to reorganize perception and identity, the emerging configurations of self reach a stage where they no longer resemble a variation of your waking identity, but instead become fully independent structures that define experience without reference to who you are outside of that state. This transition does not feel like a replacement from within the experience, because the system that would compare the current identity to your waking self is no longer operating at a level that can enforce that comparison, allowing the new configuration to become the primary framework through which perception is organized. At this point, the sense of being you is still present in form, but not in content, meaning that there is still a perspective from which experience is observed. But that perspective is no longer anchored to your personal history, your consistent traits, or your stable sense of identity. Instead, it is defined by the internal conditions that are active at that moment, which can produce a version of self that behaves, feels, and responds in ways that may differ significantly from your waking personality while still being accepted as natural within the experience. Thought and perception now operate entirely within this new configuration, creating a coherent experience that does not require alignment with your waking identity to feel real. The brain no longer attempts to maintain continuity with who you were before the transition, because the structures that support that continuity have been reduced, allowing the experience to unfold according to the internal logic of the current state, rather than the external logic of your waking life. Another critical aspect of this phase is the complete flexibility of identity, as the brain is now capable of generating perspectives that are not limited to your own, allowing you to experience situations from viewpoints that are not consistent with your waking sense of self. This can include shifts in role, context, or even the fundamental characteristics that define identity, demonstrating that the brain is not bound to a single representation of self, but can construct multiple forms depending on the conditions of the system. Emotional alignment continues to play a central role, shaping how this new version of self feels and interacts within the experience, often creating a strong sense of authenticity, even when the identity itself is different. This emotional coherence reinforces the acceptance of the new configuration, making it feel internally consistent despite its divergence from your waking self. The absence of executive control further ensures that this transformation is not questioned or resisted, as the systems responsible for maintaining consistency and evaluating identity are not fully active, allowing the experience to proceed without interruption. This lack of resistance is what allows the brain to fully inhabit these alternative configurations, creating the impression that the current identity is the only one that exists in that moment. Time, no longer acting as a stabilizing factor, allows identity to persist only as long as the internal conditions support it, meaning that these configurations can shift or dissolve without requiring a continuous narrative to connect them. This contributes to the overall fluidity of the experience, where identity is no longer a fixed point, but a dynamic element that can change as the system evolves. By the end of this phase, the transformation is complete within the experience itself, as the original waking identity is no longer the reference point for perception, and the brain is fully operating within a framework where identity is defined by internal generation, rather than by continuity with who you are when you are awake, marking the point where your brain has effectively become someone else within its own constructed reality. As the transition reaches its most advanced stage, the process that began as a gradual weakening of your waking identity culminates in a complete reorganization of the system, where the original structure that defined who you are during wakefulness is no longer active as the central reference for experience, and the brain operates entirely within internally generated configurations that do not depend on continuity with your previous sense of self. This is not a partial shift or a temporary distortion, but a full replacement within the context of the experience, where the identity that is present is entirely defined by the current state of the system, rather than by the stable framework that exists when you are awake. At this point, the brain no longer maintains any functional requirement to preserve alignment with your waking identity, because the systems that enforce that alignment, such as stable memory integration, consistent self-monitoring, and executive control, are operating at a reduced level that does not support continuity. As a result, the internally generated identity becomes the only reference point available, and it is experienced as complete and self-contained, without any need to reconcile it with an external or prior version of self. Perception, thought, and emotional response are now fully organized around this new configuration, creating a coherent internal reality in which the identity that exists within the experience feels natural, consistent, and unquestioned, even though it may differ significantly from who you are when you are awake. The brain does not attempt to compare or evaluate this difference, because the mechanisms required for such comparison are not fully active, allowing the new identity to function without contradiction. Another important aspect of this stage is that identity is no longer constrained by personal history, meaning that the continuity that normally connects your past experiences to your present sense of self is no longer required to maintain coherence. Instead, the brain generates a self that exists entirely within the current context, defined by the internal conditions that shape the experience rather than by a persistent narrative that extends across time. Emotional coherence continues to reinforce the stability of this new identity as the brain integrates affective states into the configuration, creating a sense of authenticity that makes the experience feel real and internally consistent. This emotional alignment plays a critical role in sustaining the identity within the experience, as it provides a sense of meaning and relevance that does not depend on external validation. The absence of executive oversight ensures that this replacement is not interrupted or questioned, allowing the internal system to operate freely and maintain the new configuration without interference from the structures that would normally enforce consistency with your waking self. This creates a state in which the brain is fully immersed in an internally generated identity that operates independently of the one you recognize during the day. Time perception, already detached from external reference, allows this identity to persist for as long as the internal conditions support it, without requiring continuity with previous states, reinforcing the idea that identity is no longer anchored to a stable timeline, but is instead a temporary construct that exists within the current mode of operation. By the end of this phase, the transformation is complete, and the brain is fully operating within a system where your waking identity is no longer the dominant framework of experience, demonstrating that the sense of self is not a fixed entity that persists across all states, but a configuration that can be replaced, reshaped, and redefined depending on how the brain is functioning, marking the point where your mind has fully transitioned into a state where it is no longer operating as the same you that exists when you are awake. Act 3. What this reveals about identity itself. When the entire sequence of transformation is observed from the initial destabilization of the waking self to its complete replacement within the internally generated experience, one of the most important conclusions that emerges is that identity is not a fixed entity that persists unchanged across all states, but a constructed configuration that depends entirely on how the brain is currently organizing information, perception, and memory. This matters because it directly challenges the assumption that the self exists as a stable core that remains constant regardless of changes in awareness, revealing instead that what is experienced as identity is continuously maintained and can be altered when the conditions that support it are modified. During wakefulness, the brain creates a stable sense of identity by integrating past experiences, current perception, and future-oriented thinking into a coherent narrative that allows you to perceive yourself as a consistent individual across time. This narrative is reinforced by continuous interaction with the external world, which provides feedback that stabilizes the self and anchors it to a specific context. However, the transition into sleep demonstrates that this stability is conditional, because the same brain that maintains this narrative can reorganize its internal processes in a way that no longer prioritizes that continuity. As the systems that support identity begin to weaken, the brain does not lose the ability to generate a sense of self, but instead shifts into a mode where identity is constructed differently, without the requirement to maintain alignment with your waking narrative. This shows that identity is not tied to a single, unchanging structure, but is instead a flexible construct that can take on different forms depending on the current state of the system. Another critical implication is that the brain can generate a fully coherent sense of self even when it is no longer based on your actual personal history, demonstrating that identity does not require continuity with past experience to feel real. Within the dream state, the mind accepts internally generated identities without questioning their origin, because the systems responsible for verifying consistency with your waking self are not fully active, allowing the constructed identity to function as if it were the original. This reveals that the sense of being you is not defined by a fixed essence, but by the brain's ability to create a coherent perspective within a given context, meaning that identity is less about who you inherently are and more about how your brain is currently organizing experience. The fact that this organization can change so completely without being directly perceived suggests that identity is far more adaptable and state-dependent than it appears during waking life. The reconstruction of identity upon waking further reinforces this idea, as the brain reestablishes the narrative that connects your current awareness to your past experiences, creating the impression that the same identity has persisted throughout the entire cycle, even though it has undergone significant transformation during the period of disconnection. This reconstruction is so seamless that the changes that occurred during sleep are not experienced as disruptions to identity, but as a lack of memory, preserving the illusion of continuity. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that identity is not a permanent or unchanging aspect of the mind, but a dynamic construct that is continuously generated and maintained by underlying processes, all of which can be altered without conscious awareness, revealing that the self you experienced during the day is one configuration among many that your brain is capable of producing, depending on its current state. As the transformation of identity becomes more evident, a critical question naturally arises. If the brain can generate a version of self that is different from your waking identity, why is this change not resisted, questioned, or even noticed within the experience itself? And why does the mind accept these alternative configurations as natural, even when they diverge from who you are when you are awake? The answer lies in the fact that the acceptance of identity is not determined by an objective comparison with a stable self, but by the current operational state of the brain, which defines what is considered consistent and real at any given moment. During wakefulness, the brain continuously reinforces identity through self-monitoring systems that evaluate thoughts, actions, and perceptions in relation to your established sense of self, maintaining coherence by detecting and correcting inconsistencies. These systems allow you to recognize when something does not align with your identity, creating a stable reference point that anchors your experience. However, as the transition into sleep progresses, these evaluative systems begin to lose their influence, reducing the brain's ability to compare the current experience with your waking identity. As a result, when a new configuration of self emerges within the internal system, it is not subjected to the same level of scrutiny or verification that would occur during wakefulness, allowing it to be accepted as valid without resistance. The brain does not actively decide to accept a different identity. It simply operates under conditions where the mechanisms required to question that identity are not fully active, making acceptance the default state. Another critical factor is that the internally generated identity is coherent within its own context, meaning that it provides a consistent framework for perception and action within the experience itself. Even if it differs from your waking self, it still functions as a stable reference point within the internal environment, allowing the mind to organize experience around it in a way that feels natural and uninterrupted. This internal coherence reduces the need for external validation, as the brain is no longer prioritizing alignment with reality as the standard for evaluating experience. Emotional integration further reinforces this acceptance, as the brain attaches affective significance to the internally generated identity, making it feel meaningful and relevant within the context of the experience. Emotions do not require external consistency to be perceived as real, and when they are aligned with the current configuration of self, They strengthen the sense that the identity being experienced is authentic, even if it is different from your waking identity. The reduction of executive control also plays a crucial role, as it limits the brain's ability to intervene, redirect, or question the ongoing experience, allowing the internally generated identity to persist without interruption. Without the influence of these control systems, the mind follows the path defined by its current configuration, rather than attempting to maintain consistency with an external standard. Time perception, which is already detached from external reference, contributes to this acceptance by removing the continuity that would normally allow the brain to track changes in identity over time. Without a stable timeline, the transition from one configuration of self to another is not experienced as a shift, but as a continuation, further reinforcing the illusion that the current identity has always been present. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the acceptance of being someone else is not the result of a conscious decision, but the natural outcome of operating within a system where the criteria for identity are defined by the current state of the brain, rather than by continuity with your waking self, revealing that the sense of who you are is not something you actively defend, but something that is passively maintained as long as the systems that support it remain active. As the transformation of identity progresses beyond the acceptance of alternative configurations, a deeper structural change becomes evident, one that affects not just who you are within the experience, but how your sense of continuity across time is maintained. Because the connection between past, present, and future that normally sustains a stable identity begins to weaken, fragment, and eventually lose its role as the organizing framework of the self. This matters because personal identity, as it is experienced during wakefulness, depends heavily on the ability to maintain continuity across moments, linking experiences into a coherent narrative that defines who you are over time. And when that continuity dissolves, the structure of identity changes fundamentally. During waking consciousness, your brain continuously integrates memory into present awareness, allowing you to recognize yourself as the same individual who existed moments, hours, or years before, creating a persistent sense of self that is reinforced by the stable flow of time and consistent interaction with the external world. However, as the transition into sleep advances, the systems responsible for maintaining this continuity begin to lose their stability, reducing the brain's ability to link current experience to a coherent personal history. As a result, the identity that emerges within the internal system is no longer anchored to the same narrative that defines your waking self, allowing the brain to generate a sense of self that exists primarily in the present moment, without requiring a consistent connection to past experiences. This does not feel like a loss of continuity from within the experience, because the system that would track and evaluate that continuity is not fully active, creating a condition where identity can exist without being tied to a stable timeline. Another critical aspect of this dissolution is the weakening of temporal structure, as time perception becomes increasingly detached from external reference, removing the framework that allows the brain to organize experiences into a linear sequence. Without a stable sense of before and after, the continuity that normally connects identity across time becomes less relevant, allowing the self to exist as a series of present-centered configurations rather than as a persistent entity. Memory integration, which normally reinforces continuity by connecting current awareness to past events, becomes less constrained during this phase, allowing elements from different times, contexts, and emotional states to merge without being organized into a single narrative. This blending further reduces the stability of personal continuity, as the brain no longer prioritizes maintaining a consistent history within the experience. The absence of executive control also contributes to this process, as the brain does not actively attempt to preserve continuity or correct inconsistencies, allowing identity to shift freely without requiring alignment with previous states. This lack of regulation enables the mind to operate in a way that is not dependent on maintaining a persistent self across time. Emotional coherence continues to provide a sense of stability within each moment, even as continuity across moments dissolves, creating the impression that the current identity is complete and self-contained, despite lacking a consistent connection to what came before. This reinforces the experience of being a coherent self within the moment, even though that self is not part of a continuous narrative. By the end of this phase, the dissolution of personal continuity is complete within the internal system, as identity no longer depends on a stable connection across time, but exists as a series of temporary configurations that arise and persist only as long as the underlying conditions support them, demonstrating that the sense of a continuous self is not an inherent property of the mind, but a constructed experience that depends on the consistent operation of systems that can be altered without conscious awareness. When the entire transformation is considered from beginning to end, from the initial destabilization of the waking self to the complete dissolution of continuity and the emergence of internally generated identities, a final realization becomes unavoidable. The version of you that exists during sleep is not a distorted extension of your waking identity, but a different configuration of self that operates under entirely different conditions, defined not by who you have been, but by how your brain is currently organizing experience. This matters because it challenges the assumption that there is a single, persistent self that remains unchanged across all states, revealing instead that identity is dependent on the structure of the system that generates it. During wakefulness, your sense of self is anchored by continuity, memory, external feedback, and executive control, all of which work together to maintain a stable and coherent identity that persists across time. However, during sleep, these anchoring systems are reduced or reorganized, allowing the brain to construct a self that does not require continuity with your waking life, demonstrating that identity is not tied to a single narrative, but can be redefined based on the conditions of the current state. The identity that emerges at night is not concerned with maintaining consistency with your past, because the systems that enforce that consistency are not fully active, allowing the brain to generate a perspective that is complete within itself, even if it does not align with your waking self. This internal identity feels real, not because it matches who you are during the day, but because it is coherent within the framework in which it exists, reinforcing the idea that the sense of self is determined by the current configuration of the brain rather than by an underlying constant. Another critical aspect of this realization is that the brain does not attempt to preserve a single version of identity across all states, but instead allows different configurations to emerge as needed, depending on the mode of operation. This demonstrates that the self is not a fixed entity that the brain protects or maintains at all times, but a construct that is generated in response to the requirements of the current state, whether that state is oriented toward external interaction or internal processing. The return to wakefulness involves the reconstruction of the familiar identity, as the brain reactivates the systems that integrate memory, perception, and continuity into a stable narrative, creating the impression that the same self has persisted throughout the entire cycle. However, this continuity is reconstructed rather than preserved, as the transitions between states are not fully observed, allowing the brain to connect separate configurations into a single perceived identity without revealing the underlying changes. This leads to the final truth. The self you experience is not a single, unchanging entity, but a state-dependent construction that your brain continuously generates, maintains, and, when necessary, replaces, without requiring your awareness of the transition. What feels like a stable identity is the result of consistent conditions, and when those conditions change, the identity changes with them. And this happens every night. Every night, your brain becomes a version of you that is not bound by your waking identity. Every night, the self you think is constant is replaced by something else, and you never see the exact moment it happens. ECT4. What happens after the identity shift? Once the transformation of identity reaches the point where your waking self is no longer the central reference, the brain does not remain in a state of instability, but instead reorganizes itself around the newly formed configuration, allowing this alternative version of self to stabilize and become the framework through which all perception, thought, and experience are processed. This matters because it shows that the brain does not require your original identity to maintain coherence, but can construct and sustain a completely different sense of self that feels internally consistent and functional within its own context. At this stage, the new identity is no longer emerging or forming, but operating as the active center of experience, meaning that all incoming internal signals, emotional responses, and cognitive processes are organized around this configuration, rather than around your waking self. The brain treats this identity as complete, not as a temporary or incomplete version, because the systems that would compare it to your waking identity are not fully active, allowing it to function without contradiction. Thought processes now align fully with this new configuration, following patterns that are consistent within the internal system rather than with your waking personality, which is why actions, decisions, and reactions within dreams can feel natural, even when they differ from how you would behave while awake. The brain does not attempt to correct or adjust these differences because it is no longer prioritizing alignment with your waking identity as a requirement for coherence. Perception also becomes fully integrated within this framework, as the internally generated environment is interpreted through the perspective of the current identity, reinforcing the sense that this version of self is the one that belongs in that context. This integration creates a seamless experience where the identity and the environment support each other, forming a coherent internal reality that does not depend on external reference. Emotional consistency plays a critical role in stabilizing this identity, as the brain aligns affective states with the current configuration, creating a sense of authenticity that reinforces the experience of being that version of self. These emotional responses are not compared to your waking reactions, but are evaluated only within the context of the internal system, further strengthening the stability of the new identity. The absence of executive oversight ensures that this stabilization process is not interrupted by self-reflection or doubt, allowing the brain to fully commit to the internally generated configuration without attempting to reconcile it with your waking self. This lack of interference is essential for maintaining the coherence of the experience, as it prevents the reintroduction of conflicting identity structures. Time perception, already detached from external reality, allows this identity to persist without requiring continuity with previous states, meaning that the sense of self is maintained only within the current context, without needing to connect to a larger narrative that extends beyond the internal experience. This further reinforces the autonomy of the new identity. By the end of this phase, the alternative identity has become fully stabilized within the internal system, functioning as the primary framework of experience, and demonstrating that the brain is capable of sustaining a coherent sense of self that is entirely independent of your waking identity, setting the stage for deeper exploration of how this internally generated self operates within its own reality. Once the new identity stabilizes as the central reference point of experience, the brain begins to operate within the internally generated environment, using this configuration as the basis for perception, interpretation, and response, creating a system in which navigation through the internal world does not depend on your waking self, but on the rules and structures defined by the current state. This matters because it shows that the brain is not only capable of generating alternative identities, but also of using them to interact with a fully constructed environment in a way that feels coherent, intentional, and self-contained. At this stage, the internally generated world is no longer experienced as fragmented or unstable, but as a structured environment that provides context for the identity that inhabits it, allowing perception to function in a way that resembles external interaction, even though it is entirely generated from within. The new identity interprets this environment as if it were real, not because it matches external reality, but because it is processed through the same perceptual systems that would normally interpret real sensory input, creating a seamless experience of interaction. Decision-making within this state operates differently from waking cognition, as it is not guided by long-term goals, consistent personality traits, or stable self-reflection, but by immediate context, emotional alignment, and associative processes that arise within the internal system. This results in actions that feel natural within the experience, even when they do not align with how you would behave while awake, demonstrating that the brain can simulate purposeful behavior without relying on the same structures that define your waking identity. Attention, while less stable than in wakefulness, still functions as a mechanism for selecting and engaging with elements of the internal environment, allowing the identity to focus on specific aspects of the experience without maintaining a continuous or controlled direction. This selective engagement contributes to the sense of immersion, as the identity interacts with the environment in a way that feels responsive and meaningful within the context of the internal system. Another important aspect of this navigation is the fluidity of perspective, as the brain allows the identity to shift its point of view or role within the environment, without requiring a stable anchor to maintain consistency. This flexibility enables the experience to adapt dynamically, allowing the identity to move through different scenarios, contexts, or roles without recognizing these shifts as inconsistencies, further reinforcing the autonomy of the internal system. Emotional responses continue to guide interaction within this environment, providing a sense of relevance and urgency that shapes how the identity engages with the experience. These emotional cues function as a form of internal feedback, directing attention and influencing behavior in the absence of external input, allowing the system to maintain coherence without relying on real-world consequences. Memory integration within this state is selective and context-dependent, meaning that the identity may have access to certain elements of memory while lacking others, creating a sense of continuity within the experience without requiring full alignment with your waking history. This selective integration supports the stability of the current identity while maintaining the flexibility needed for the internal system to operate independently. The absence of executive control continues to allow this navigation to unfold without deliberate oversight, meaning that the identity does not consciously plan or regulate its actions, but instead follows the flow of internally generated processes, creating the impression of autonomy without requiring conscious direction. By the end of this phase, the new identity is fully engaged with the internal environment, navigating it as if it were a coherent and self-contained reality, demonstrating that the brain can generate not only alternative forms of self, but also entire systems of interaction in which those selves can operate, further reinforcing the independence of the internal state from your waking identity. As the internally generated identity continues to operate within the constructed environment, one of the most striking aspects of the experience is the complete absence of doubt regarding its authenticity, even when the identity itself and the surrounding world differ significantly from your waking reality. Because the brain is no longer evaluating experience based on external consistency, but on internal coherence, allowing the current configuration of self and environment to be accepted as real without requiring validation from outside the system. This matters because it reveals that the sense of reality is not determined by objective alignment with the external world, but by the conditions under which the brain processes and organizes experience. During wakefulness, the brain continuously verifies perception by comparing incoming sensory data with stored knowledge and expectations, using executive systems to detect inconsistencies and maintain a stable model of reality. However, in this internally generated state, those evaluative systems are operating at a reduced level, limiting the brain's ability to question or challenge the validity of what is being experienced. As a result, the identity within the experience does not evaluate whether it is real in relation to your waking self, but simply operates within the framework that is currently active. At the same time, the sensory simulation generated by the brain is processed through pathways that closely resemble those used for real perception, creating visual, auditory, and emotional experiences that feel immediate and convincing. This overlap in processing means that the brain treats internally generated signals as if they were externally derived, reinforcing the sense that the experience is real from within, even though it has no direct connection to the external environment. Emotional integration plays a crucial role in reinforcing this realism, as the brain attaches significance and urgency to the events occurring within the experience, making them feel meaningful and relevant. These emotional responses do not require external validation to be perceived as real. And when they are aligned with the current identity, they strengthen the sense that the experience is authentic, further reducing the likelihood that it will be questioned. The coherence of the internal system also contributes to this effect, as the brain organizes the experience in a way that maintains consistency within the current context, even if that consistency does not align with external reality. As long as the experience follows its own internal logic, the identity accepts it as real, because the brain is not actively comparing it to an external standard. The absence of a stable reference to your waking identity further prevents the detection of inconsistency, as there is no continuous baseline against which the current experience can be measured. Without this reference, the identity within the experience has no basis for recognizing that it is different from your waking self, allowing the internally generated configuration to function as the only available reality. Time perception, already detached from external structure, removes another layer of verification, as the lack of consistent temporal progression makes it more difficult for the brain to detect discrepancies over time, allowing the experience to unfold without being challenged by inconsistencies that might otherwise be recognized. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the reason the experience feels completely real is not because it matches external reality, but because the brain is operating in a mode where internal coherence is the only standard that matters, demonstrating that the sense of reality is a function of how experience is processed rather than where it originates, and reinforcing the idea that the identity within this state fully accepts the internally generated world as its reality. As the internally generated identity continues to operate within its own coherent framework, the system does not remain static, because the same processes that allowed this alternative configuration of self to emerge and stabilize are also subject to change, eventually leading to a phase where the conditions that sustain that identity begin to weaken, initiating a reversal that is as gradual and imperceptible as the transformation that preceded it. This matters because it reveals that the identity formed during this state is not permanent, but dependent on the stability of the internal conditions that support it. And when those conditions begin to shift, the identity itself can no longer maintain its structure. At this stage, the internal environment starts to lose its coherence, not through a sudden collapse, but through subtle inconsistencies that gradually reduce the stability of the experience, causing the identity to lose its central role as the organizing framework. Thought patterns become less structured, perception becomes less stable, and the internal logic that once maintained the coherence of the experience begins to fragment, creating conditions where the identity can no longer function as a complete and self-contained system. The brain begins to reallocate resources once again, reducing the dominance of internally generated processes and gradually restoring the systems responsible for external orientation, including sensory integration, attention, and executive control. However, this restoration does not occur instantly. And during this transitional phase, the identity that was previously stable begins to dissolve, not because it is actively removed, but because the conditions required to sustain it are no longer present. As the internal system weakens, elements of the waking identity begin to re-emerge, but not in a fully integrated form, creating a temporary overlap where aspects of both identities may coexist without being fully aligned. This overlap is unstable and short-lived. As the brain continues to shift toward re-establishing the waking configuration, gradually reconstructing the sense of self that is anchored to external reality, memory of the internally generated identity also begins to fade during this process, as the systems responsible for encoding and retaining those experiences are not fully aligned with the waking mode of operation, resulting in a partial or complete loss of continuity between the internal identity and the one that is being restored. This contributes to the impression that the experience was less defined or less real, even though it felt fully coherent while it was occurring. The sense of self transitions back toward a stable, continuous identity as the brain reactivates the processes that integrate memory, perception, and attention into a coherent narrative, allowing the waking identity to re-establish itself as the primary framework of experience. However, just as with the initial transformation, the exact moment when the internally generated identity disappears is not fully perceived, because awareness becomes stable only after the critical point of transition has already passed. By the end of this phase, the alternative identity has dissolved completely, replaced by the reconstructed waking self, demonstrating that identity within this system is not fixed, but temporary, emerging and disappearing as the underlying conditions change, and reinforcing the idea that the self you experience is not a permanent entity, but a state-dependent construction that your brain continuously generates and replaces without your direct awareness of the transitions that define it. Act 5. What this means about who you really are. When the entire sequence is observed from the perspective of transformation rather than experience, a fundamental implication begins to emerge, one that challenges the idea of a single, stable identity. Because if your brain can systematically weaken, replace, and then reconstruct your sense of self every night without your awareness of the transition. It suggests that the version of you that you recognize during the day is not the only form your identity can take, but one configuration among many that your brain is capable of generating, depending on its current state. This matters because it reframes identity not as a fixed core that persists unchanged, but as a dynamic structure that is continuously produced and maintained by underlying processes that can operate differently under different conditions. During wakefulness, your identity feels singular because it is supported by stable integration of memory, consistent external feedback, and continuous self-monitoring, all of which reinforce the sense that you are the same person across time and context. However, the transition into sleep demonstrates that this stability is conditional, because the same brain that maintains this coherent identity can reorganize itself in a way that produces alternative configurations that feel equally real while they are active, even though they do not align with your waking self. The existence of these alternative configurations shows that identity is not tied to a single set of traits, memories, or behaviors, but can be restructured based on how the brain organizes information in a given state, allowing different versions of self to emerge when the conditions that support the waking identity are altered. This does not mean that your waking identity is false, but that it is not the only possible expression of who you can be, within the range of states your brain can produce. Another critical implication is that the brain does not require a continuous connection between these configurations to maintain the overall sense of self, because the transitions between them are not fully observed, allowing the mind to reconstruct a narrative that connects them into a single perceived identity. This reconstruction creates the illusion that the same self has persisted throughout, even though the underlying configuration may have changed significantly during periods of reduced awareness. The role of memory in this process is particularly important, as it allows the brain to reestablish continuity by linking the waking identity to its past experiences, while excluding or fragmenting the internally generated identities that existed during sleep, effectively preserving the dominance of the waking self within conscious awareness. This selective integration reinforces the perception that identity is stable, even though it is subject to change. The ability of the brain to generate multiple configurations of identity also highlights the adaptability of the system, demonstrating that the self is not a rigid structure, but a flexible construct that can adjust to different modes of operation, whether those modes are oriented toward external interaction or internal processing. This adaptability is essential for the brain's ability to function across different states, but it also reveals that identity is more fluid than it appears during waking life. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that your identity is not a single permanent version of self, but a state-dependent construction that your brain can modify, replace, and reconstruct based on its current configuration, revealing that the you experience is one expression among many possibilities that exist within the system that generates your sense of self. As the implications of identity being state-dependent continue to unfold, another realization begins to take shape, one that directly affects how you perceive yourself across time. Because if your brain reconstructs your identity every morning after passing through a state in which your waking self is no longer active, then the sense that you are the same person every day is not the result of an uninterrupted continuity of self, but of a reconstruction that connects separate states into a single narrative that feels stable and consistent. This matters because it suggests that the continuity you experience is not something that inherently persists, but something that is actively rebuilt each time the conditions for your waking identity are restored. During wakefulness, the brain maintains a consistent identity by continuously integrating new experiences with existing memory, reinforcing the sense that the self is stable and persistent across time. This ongoing integration creates the impression that the person you are now is directly connected to the person you were yesterday, and that this connection is unbroken. However, the nightly transition into sleep demonstrates that this continuity is not maintained through continuous awareness, because there are periods where the systems that sustain your waking identity are reduced or replaced by alternative configurations. When you wake up, the brain does not simply resume the exact same identity from where it left off, but reconstructs it by reactivating memory, restoring external orientation, and re-establishing the narrative that defines who you are. This reconstruction process is so efficient that it creates the illusion of continuity, making it appear as though the same identity has persisted throughout the entire cycle, even though it has undergone significant transformation during the period of disconnection. Another important aspect of this illusion is the selective nature of memory, as the brain prioritizes the retention of information that reinforces the waking identity, while allowing internally generated experiences to fade or become fragmented. This selective retention ensures that the reconstructed identity remains consistent with past experiences, even though it excludes the alternative configurations that existed during sleep, further strengthening the perception of continuity. The role of external feedback also contributes to this illusion, as interaction with the environment reinforces the reconstructed identity by providing consistent signals that align with your expectations of who you are, allowing the brain to stabilize the self within a familiar context. This external reinforcement makes it more difficult to recognize that identity is being reconstructed rather than simply continued. Time perception plays a key role in maintaining this illusion, as the brain organizes experiences into a linear sequence that connects past, present, and future, creating a coherent timeline in which identity appears to persist. However, this timeline is dependent on the brain's ability to track and integrate experiences. And when that ability is altered during sleep, the continuity of identity is temporarily disrupted, even though this disruption is not directly perceived. The absence of awareness during the critical points of transition further reinforces the illusion, because the brain cannot observe the moments when identity is altered or reconstructed, preventing the detection of discontinuity and allowing the narrative of a persistent self to remain intact. This creates a seamless connection between separate states, masking the underlying changes that occur. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the feeling of being the same person every day is not the result of a continuous, unbroken identity, but of a highly effective reconstruction process that connects separate configurations into a single perceived self, revealing that the continuity you experience is an illusion maintained by the brain's ability to rebuild identity in a way that appears stable and consistent across time. As the implications of identity reconstruction become clearer, a deeper question emerges. If your brain is capable of replacing your sense of self with an entirely different configuration during sleep, why does this process occur without resistance, without conflict, and without any attempt from your waking identity to preserve itself or prevent the change? The answer lies in the fact that identity does not possess an independent mechanism of defense or persistence outside of the systems that generate it, meaning that when those systems are altered, the identity they sustain does not resist being replaced, because the capacity for resistance is part of what is being reduced during the transition. During wakefulness, the sense of self appears stable and intentional, because it is supported by executive systems that maintain control, evaluate consistency, and reinforce continuity, creating the impression that identity is something actively maintained. However, this maintenance depends entirely on the ongoing activity of these systems, and as they begin to weaken during the transition into sleep, the ability to sustain and defend the waking identity diminishes along with them. This means that identity is not an independent entity that persists regardless of changes in the system, but a byproduct of the system's current configuration. And when that configuration shifts, the identity changes with it. The brain does not need to override or suppress the waking self, because the conditions required for that self to exist are no longer being maintained, making replacement a natural outcome rather than a contested process. Another critical factor is the reduction of self-awareness during the transition, as the brain gradually loses the ability to monitor and evaluate its own state, preventing the detection of the changes that are occurring. Without the ability to recognize that identity is being altered, there is no basis for resistance, allowing the process to unfold without interruption. The internally generated identity that emerges during this process does not perceive itself as a replacement, but as the current and only version of self, because it operates within a system that does not maintain a continuous reference to the waking identity. This lack of reference eliminates the possibility of comparison, which is necessary for resistance to occur, further ensuring that the transition remains seamless. Emotional alignment also plays a role in preventing resistance, as the brain integrates affective states into the new configuration, creating a sense of authenticity and coherence that reinforces the experience of being that identity. These emotional cues provide internal validation, making the new configuration feel natural rather than foreign, reducing the likelihood of conflict. The absence of executive control further ensures that the process cannot be interrupted, as the systems responsible for deliberate action and decision-making are not fully active, preventing the brain from attempting to maintain the waking identity or reverse the transition. Without these systems, the brain follows the path defined by its current configuration, allowing the replacement to occur without intervention. Time perception, already destabilized, removes the continuity that would allow the brain to track the change as a process, making the transition appear instantaneous from the perspective of memory, even though it is gradual in reality. This lack of temporal awareness prevents the formation of a narrative in which identity is actively replaced, further reinforcing the seamless nature of the transition. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the brain can replace your identity without resistance, because the systems that would enable resistance are part of the same structure that is being altered, revealing that identity does not persist independently of the conditions that sustain it, and that when those conditions change, the self changes with them without conflict or awareness of the transition. When all the elements of the sequence are brought together, the gradual weakening of the waking identity, the emergence of alternative configurations, the complete replacement of the self within the internal system, and the seamless reconstruction upon waking, the final implication becomes unavoidable. The you that you experience is not a single permanent entity, but one expression among multiple possible configurations that your brain can generate, maintain, and replace, depending on its current state. This matters because it reframes identity not as something you possess, but as something your brain produces, revealing that the self is not fixed, but dynamically constructed. During the day, your identity feels singular and continuous because the systems that support it are stable and consistently active, allowing memory, perception, and attention to align in a way that creates a coherent narrative of self. However, the nightly transition demonstrates that this narrative is not preserved across all states. because the same brain that maintains it can reorganize its internal processes in a way that produces entirely different configurations of identity, each of which can function as a complete and self-contained version of self while it is active. The existence of these multiple configurations shows that identity is not limited to a single structure, but can take on different forms depending on how the brain organizes information, meaning that the self you experience during wakefulness is one version among many that exist within the system. This does not diminish the reality of your waking identity, but it reveals that it is not the only possible expression of who you can be. Another critical implication is that the brain does not maintain awareness of these different configurations simultaneously, but instead operates within one at a time, reconstructing continuity by linking them into a single narrative that feels uninterrupted. This reconstruction creates the illusion that the same self has persisted across all states, even though the underlying configuration has changed. The role of memory in maintaining this illusion is essential, as the brain selectively integrates experiences that align with the waking identity, while allowing internally generated identities to fade or become fragmented, ensuring that the reconstructed self remains consistent with past experience. This selective integration reinforces the perception of a single, continuous identity, even though multiple configurations have existed. The inability to observe the transitions between these configurations further supports this illusion, because the moments when identity changes are not fully perceived, preventing the detection of discontinuity and allowing the narrative of a persistent self to remain intact. This creates a seamless experience in which identity appears stable, even though it is continuously being reconstructed. The broader implication is that identity is not a fixed core that exists independently of the brain's state, but a dynamic construct that emerges from the interaction of multiple systems, all of which can be altered without conscious awareness. This means that who you are is not defined by a single, unchanging essence, but by the current configuration of the processes that generate your sense of self. By the end of this phase, the conclusion is clear. You are not just one self, but a system capable of producing multiple versions of identity, each of which can feel real, complete, and coherent while it is active, revealing that the self you experience is one of many possible expressions that your brain can create, maintain, and replace as it moves through different states of operation. Act 6. Long-term implications of becoming someone else. When the entire sequence is considered beyond the immediate experience, beyond the shift, beyond the replacement, and beyond the reconstruction, a deeper implication begins to emerge. One that affects how you understand not only identity, but trust in your own sense of self. Because if the brain can generate, dissolve, and replace your identity without your awareness, then the version of yourself that you trust during wakefulness is not an absolute reference point, but a condition that depends entirely on the stability of the systems that sustain it. This matters because it reveals that the self you rely on is not something inherently constant, but something that exists only as long as the underlying processes remain aligned. During the day, your sense of identity feels reliable because it is supported by continuous feedback, stable memory integration, and consistent external interaction, all of which reinforce the perception that the self is persistent and dependable. However, the nightly transition demonstrates that this reliability is conditional, because the same brain that maintains this stable identity can reorganize itself in a way that produces entirely different configurations of self that feel equally real while they are active. This suggests that the trust you place in your identity is not based on an unchanging core, but on the assumption that the systems supporting that identity will remain stable. an assumption that is challenged by the fact that those systems are regularly altered during the transition into sleep. The self you trust is not invalid, but it is not permanent, because it depends on conditions that are subject to change. Another critical implication is that the brain does not require a consistent identity to function effectively, as it can operate under different configurations without losing its ability to generate coherent experience. This demonstrates that identity is not the foundation of cognition, but one layer within a system that can adapt its structure, depending on its current mode of operation. The inability to observe the transition between identities further reinforces the conditional nature of the self, because it prevents awareness from recognizing the moment when identity is altered, allowing the reconstructed identity to feel continuous and stable, even though it has been replaced. This creates a seamless experience that masks the underlying changes, reinforcing the perception of a consistent self. Memory plays a key role in maintaining this perception, as the brain reconstructs identity by linking current awareness to past experiences, while excluding or fragmenting the alternative configurations that existed during sleep, ensuring that the waking self remains dominant within conscious awareness. This selective reconstruction preserves the illusion of continuity, even though the underlying structure has changed. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the self you trust is not an absolute or permanent entity, but a state-dependent construction that depends on the stability of the systems that generate it, revealing that your sense of identity is reliable only within the conditions that support it, and that those conditions are not constant, but continuously shifting as the brain moves between different modes of operation. As the implications of identity being conditional continue to expand, another critical realization emerges, one that reveals the true capacity of the brain to generate not just fragments of self, but fully structured and coherent identities that function as complete systems within their own context, demonstrating that the mind is capable of simulating an entire sense of self without relying on the continuity, history, or stability of your waking identity. This matters because it shows that identity is not dependent on authenticity in the traditional sense, but on coherence within the current state of the system, meaning that a simulated identity can feel just as real and complete as the one you experience while awake. During wakefulness, your identity is reinforced by a continuous integration of memory, perception, and external feedback, which creates the impression that the self is grounded in reality and shaped by a consistent personal history. However, during the internally generated state, the brain does not require this continuity to produce a functional identity, because it can reorganize available information, memories, emotions, sensory fragments, and associative patterns into a configuration that operates as a complete self within the experience. This simulated identity does not need to align with your waking self to be coherent, because the systems responsible for evaluating consistency with your personal history are not fully active, allowing the brain to construct a version of self that is internally valid even if it differs significantly from who you are when you are awake. The result is an identity that feels natural within the context of the experience, not because it is accurate, but because it is complete within the framework in which it exists. Another important aspect of this simulation is that the brain uses the same neural pathways involved in real perception and cognition to generate the internally constructed identity, meaning that the processes that define how you think, feel, and perceive are engaged in a way that mirrors waking experience. This overlap in processing is what allows the simulated identity to feel authentic, as the brain does not distinguish between internally generated and externally derived signals when operating in this mode. Emotional integration plays a central role in reinforcing the completeness of the simulated identity, as the brain attaches affective significance to the experiences associated with this configuration, creating a sense of relevance and meaning that strengthens the perception that the identity is real. These emotional cues provide internal validation, making the experience feel genuine even in the absence of external confirmation. The absence of executive control further allows the simulation to proceed without interruption, as the brain does not actively question or regulate the identity being generated, allowing it to function as the primary framework of experience without interference from the systems that would normally enforce consistency with your waking self. This lack of regulation is essential for maintaining the integrity of the simulated identity, as it prevents the introduction of conflicting information. Time perception, already detached from external reference, enables the simulated identity to exist without requiring continuity across a stable timeline, allowing the brain to construct a sense of self that is complete within the moment, even if it is not connected to a broader narrative that extends beyond the experience. This reinforces the autonomy of the simulated identity, as it does not depend on past or future to feel real. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the mind is capable of generating a complete identity within itself, one that can function, perceive, and interact as if it were real, demonstrating that the sense of self is not limited to a single configuration, but can be simulated in multiple forms depending on the conditions of the system, revealing the full extent of the brain's ability to construct identity as a dynamic and adaptable process. As the brain demonstrates its capacity to generate complete and coherent identities within the internal system, the distinction between what is considered you and what could be considered another version of you begins to lose its clarity. Because the criteria that define identity during wakefulness, continuity, memory, and stable self-reference are no longer consistently applied, allowing multiple configurations of self to exist under conditions where the boundary between them is not strictly maintained. This matters because it challenges the assumption that identity is defined by a fixed set of characteristics, revealing instead that it is shaped by the conditions under which it is generated. During waking consciousness, the sense of self is reinforced by continuous integration of past experiences, creating a stable identity that is perceived as distinct and singular, allowing you to differentiate yourself from others and maintain a clear boundary between who you are and who you are not. However, during the internally generated state, this boundary is not preserved in the same way, because the systems that enforce it are not fully active, allowing the brain to construct identities that do not require strict separation from your waking self. This means that the identity experienced within this state is not necessarily perceived as other, even when it differs significantly from your waking self, because the brain does not maintain a continuous reference that would allow for that distinction to be recognized. Instead, the current configuration is accepted as the only available identity, and without comparison, there is no basis for perceiving it as separate. Another critical aspect of this blurred boundary is the flexibility of perspective, as the brain can generate experiences in which identity shifts without requiring a stable anchor, allowing different configurations to emerge, coexist briefly, or replace one another without being recognized as distinct entities. This flexibility demonstrates that identity is not tied to a single, continuous framework, but can be reconfigured dynamically based on the state of the system. Memory integration also plays a role in this process, as the brain selectively includes or excludes information that would reinforce continuity with your waking self, further reducing the ability to distinguish between different configurations of identity. Without a stable narrative connecting these states, the distinction between you and another you becomes less meaningful, as each configuration operates independently within its own context. Emotional coherence reinforces the acceptance of the current identity, as the brain aligns affective states with the configuration that is active, creating a sense of authenticity that does not depend on external validation or comparison with your waking self. This emotional alignment strengthens the perception that the current identity is real, even if it differs from your usual sense of self. The absence of executive control further prevents the brain from analyzing or questioning the nature of identity within the experience, allowing the boundary between different configurations to remain undefined, as there is no mechanism actively maintaining or enforcing that distinction. This lack of evaluation is what allows the brain to move between different forms of self without resistance or awareness of the change. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the boundary between you and another you is not a fixed line, but a condition that depends on the systems that define identity. And when those systems are altered, the distinction becomes fluid, revealing that identity is not an absolute separation, but a dynamic construct that can shift, depending on how the brain is organizing experience at any given moment. When all the elements are brought together, the instability of identity, the emergence of alternative configurations, the complete simulation of self, and the fluid boundary between different versions, it becomes clear that the idea of a single, consistent you does not apply in the same way during this state, because the brain is no longer operating under the conditions required to maintain a unified identity, and instead allows multiple configurations of self to exist across different moments without enforcing continuity between them. This matters because it reveals that the concept of a singular identity is not an absolute truth, but a condition that depends on the stability of the systems that define it. During wakefulness, the brain maintains the illusion of a single self by continuously integrating experience into a coherent narrative, reinforcing the perception that there is one identity that persists across time. However, during the internally generated state, this narrative is no longer required to maintain coherence, allowing the brain to construct identities that exist independently within their own context, without needing to connect to a larger, continuous framework. This means that at night, there is not one stable version of you that persists throughout the experience, but a series of configurations that arise, operate, and dissolve as the underlying conditions change, each functioning as a complete identity while it is active, even though it is not connected to the others in a continuous way. These configurations are not fragments of a single self, but independent expressions of identity generated by the same system under different conditions. Another critical implication is that the brain does not attempt to maintain awareness of these multiple configurations simultaneously, because it operates within one at a time, allowing each to function as the primary framework of experience while it is active. This prevents the detection of discontinuity, as there is no simultaneous comparison between different identities, reinforcing the perception that the current configuration is the only one that exists. Memory plays a key role in maintaining this perception, as the brain does not fully retain the transitions between different configurations, allowing the reconstructed waking identity to remain dominant within conscious awareness while the internally generated identities fade or become fragmented. This selective retention ensures that the experience of multiple identities does not disrupt the overall sense of a single self during wakefulness. The inability to observe the transitions between these configurations further reinforces this effect, as the moments when identity changes are not fully perceived. preventing the formation of a continuous narrative that includes all configurations. This creates a seamless experience in which each identity feels complete while it is active, even though it is part of a larger pattern of change. The broader implication is that the self is not a singular entity that exists independently of the brain's state, but a dynamic system capable of producing multiple identities depending on how it is configured, revealing that the concept of a single, unified self is a state-dependent experience rather than an inherent property of the mind. By the end of this phase, the conclusion becomes clear. At night, there is no single you that persists across the entire experience, but a sequence of identities that emerge and dissolve as the brain moves through different configurations, demonstrating that the self is not fixed, but continuously generated and redefined based on the conditions of the system, and that what you experience as a stable identity is one version among many that your brain can create. Act 7. The final pattern of identity. When the entire sequence is examined as a unified system rather than a series of isolated transformations, the pattern that emerges does not simply describe how identity changes, but fundamentally redefines what identity is, revealing that the sense of self is not an entity that exists independently and persists unchanged, but a process that is continuously generated by the brain through the coordinated activity of multiple systems that must remain aligned in order for that identity to exist in a stable and recognizable form. This matters because it shifts the understanding of the self from something that is possessed to something that is produced, indicating that identity is not something you carry with you across all states, but something your brain actively constructs under specific conditions. During wakefulness, this process appears invisible because it operates with such consistency that the output it generates, the sense of being a stable, continuous self, feels permanent, even though it depends entirely on the ongoing alignment of systems responsible for memory integration, attention, perception, executive control, and temporal continuity. These systems work together to create a coherent narrative that links past, present, and anticipated future into a single, unified experience, reinforcing the belief that identity is fixed rather than constructed. However, the nightly transition demonstrates that this apparent stability is not inherent, because when these systems begin to lose synchronization, the process that generates identity changes its output. As the brain shifts away from external orientation and toward internal processing, the structures that maintain a stable identity begin to weaken, not because the brain is losing its ability to function, but because it is reallocating resources to processes that do not require the same configuration of self. This reveals that identity is not the foundation of cognition, but one configuration among many that the brain can adopt depending on its current priorities, meaning that when those priorities change, the identity that emerges changes as well. The critical insight here is that identity does not disappear when the waking self is no longer active. It is replaced by alternative configurations that are generated by the same underlying process, operating under different conditions, demonstrating that the brain is not preserving a single self, but continuously producing versions of self that are appropriate for the current state. This replacement is seamless from within the experience, because the system does not maintain simultaneous awareness of multiple configurations, allowing each version to function as the complete identity while it is active. Another important implication of viewing identity as a process is that continuity is not maintained by preserving the same self across time, but by reconstructing it each time the necessary conditions are restored, particularly during the transition back to wakefulness. where the brain reactivates the systems that support the familiar identity and reconnects it to memory in a way that creates the impression of uninterrupted persistence. This reconstruction is so precise that it masks the underlying changes, allowing the self to appear constant even though it has been replaced and rebuilt. The role of memory in this process is especially significant because it provides the material that the brain uses to reconstruct identity, selecting and integrating information that reinforces continuity, while excluding or fragmenting experiences that do not align with the waking self, such as those that occur during internally generated states. This selective integration ensures that the reconstructed identity remains coherent and consistent with past experience, even though it does not fully account for the alternative configurations that existed. The inability to observe the transitions between these configurations further reinforces the perception that identity is an entity rather than a process, because the moments when the system changes its output are not accessible to awareness, preventing the detection of discontinuity and allowing the brain to present a seamless narrative of self. This creates a powerful illusion of permanence, even though the underlying process is dynamic and continuously adjusting. By the end of this expanded phase, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Identity is not something that exists independently of the brain's operation, but something that is continuously generated by a process that can produce different outputs depending on the current state, revealing that the self you experience is not a fixed entity, but the result of an ongoing construction that is stable only as long as the conditions that sustain it remain aligned. As identity is understood not as a fixed entity but as an ongoing process, another layer of the pattern begins to reveal itself, one that explains not only how different versions of self can exist, but why the transitions between them remain completely hidden from direct awareness, even though they define the most critical changes in how experience is structured. This matters because it shows that the continuity you perceive is not the result of an uninterrupted identity, but the result of transitions that occur without being observed, allowing separate configurations of self to be experienced as a single, continuous presence. Throughout the cycle, the brain moves from one configuration of identity to another, not through abrupt replacement, but through gradual shifts in the systems that generate the sense of self, including changes in attention, memory integration, perception, and executive control. These shifts alter the structure of identity step by step, reducing the influence of one configuration while increasing the influence of another, creating a transition that is continuous in process but not continuous in conscious awareness. The reason these transitions remain invisible is not because they are too subtle to detect, but because the mechanisms required to observe them are part of the same system that is being altered during the shift. As the brain changes the configuration of identity, it simultaneously reduces the capacity for self-monitoring and temporal tracking, which are necessary for recognizing that a transition is occurring. This creates a structural limitation, where awareness cannot fully perceive the moment when one identity gives way to another. This limitation is present both during the transition into sleep and during the return to wakefulness, creating two consistent points in the cycle where identity changes without being directly observed. During the descent, the waking identity loses stability before awareness can register the exact moment of its dissolution, while during the return, the waking identity is reconstructed only after the critical point of reactivation has already passed, preventing awareness from observing the moment of reemergence. Another critical factor is the role of temporal continuity, as the brain relies on a stable sense of time to track changes and maintain a coherent narrative of self. When time perception becomes unstable, or detached from external reference. As it does during these transitions, the brain loses the framework needed to organize the shift as a sequence of events, making it impossible to identify a clear boundary between one identity and another. Memory also contributes to the invisibility of these transitions, as the brain does not fully encode the moments when identity is being altered, resulting in gaps that are later filled by the reconstruction of continuity. These gaps are not experienced as interruptions, but as the absence of memory, which reinforces the illusion that identity has remained constant throughout the cycle. The combination of reduced self-monitoring, disrupted temporal structure, and incomplete memory encoding ensures that the transitions between different configurations of identity remain hidden, even though they are central to how the system operates. This creates a situation where identity appears stable not because it is unchanging, but because the changes are not directly accessible to awareness. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the movement between different versions of self is defined by transitions that are real in their effect, but invisible in perception, revealing that the continuity of identity is not maintained by preserving a single self, but by obscuring the moments when that self is altered, allowing multiple configurations to be experienced as one uninterrupted identity. As the structure of identity is fully revealed as a process that generates multiple configurations across different states, the most persistent illusion that remains is the belief that there is only one version of you, a single self that exists continuously and consistently across all experiences, even though the system itself demonstrates that identity can be replaced, reconfigured, and reconstructed without being directly perceived. This matters because it shows that the sense of being one unified self is not a fundamental truth, but a perception maintained by the brain's ability to conceal the transitions that would otherwise reveal its variability. During wakefulness, this illusion is reinforced by the stability of the systems that maintain identity, including continuous memory integration, consistent external feedback, and stable attention, all of which create a coherent narrative that links past, present, and future into a single thread. This narrative gives the impression that the same self persists over time, because there are no visible breaks within the flow of experience under normal conditions. However, the nightly transition demonstrates that this continuity is not preserved across all states, as the waking identity is replaced by alternative configurations that operate independently within the internal system. The reason this does not disrupt the perception of a single self is that the brain does not maintain simultaneous awareness of multiple configurations, but instead operates within one at a time, allowing each to function as the complete identity while it is active. Without simultaneous comparison, there is no basis for recognizing that different versions of self have existed, reinforcing the perception that there is only one. Another critical factor is the role of memory, as the brain selectively integrates experiences that align with the waking identity, while allowing internally generated identities to fade or become fragmented, ensuring that the reconstructed self remains consistent with past experience. This selective retention effectively filters out the evidence of multiple configurations, preserving the narrative of a single, continuous identity. The invisibility of transitions further strengthens this illusion, as the moments when identity changes are not fully perceived, preventing the detection of discontinuity and allowing the brain to connect separate configurations into a single perceived self. These hidden transitions act as boundaries that define the shifts between identities, but because they are not accessible to awareness, they do not appear as breaks within the narrative. Time perception also plays a key role in maintaining the illusion, as the brain organizes experiences into a linear sequence that supports the continuity of identity. When this temporal structure is stable, identity appears consistent, but when it is altered during internal states, the continuity is temporarily disrupted without being directly observed, allowing the illusion to persist once normal time perception is restored. The broader implication is that the sense of being oneself is not the result of an unchanging identity, but of a system that presents only one configuration at a time and reconstructs continuity by linking those configurations into a coherent narrative. This means that the one you experience is not the only version that exists, but the only one you are aware of at any given moment. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that the belief in a single, unified self is sustained not by the absence of alternative configurations, but by the brain's ability to conceal them, revealing that the identity you experience is part of a larger system capable of generating multiple selves, even though only one is ever accessible to awareness at a time. When every layer of the pattern is fully revealed, from identity as a process, to the invisible transitions between configurations, to the illusion of a single self, the final realization is not just that your identity can change, but that what you experience as who you are is the result of a system that continuously generates a version of self that feels stable only because you are never aware of the moments when it is replaced. This matters because it fundamentally reframes identity from something that exists independently of change into something that is defined by change, maintained only through the brain's ability to reconstruct continuity without exposing the transitions that make that continuity possible. Throughout the entire cycle, the brain does not preserve a single identity across all states, but moves through different configurations that are each complete within their own context, even though they are not connected by a continuously perceived experience. The waking self, the internally generated identities, and the reconstructed self upon waking are all products of the same process, each emerging under different conditions and operating as the primary framework of experience while active. The reason this does not fragment your sense of self is that the brain never presents these configurations simultaneously and never allows you to observe the exact moment when one becomes another. Instead, it reconstructs a seamless narrative that links them together, creating the impression of a single, uninterrupted identity that persists across all states. This narrative is so coherent that it overrides the underlying complexity of the system, allowing you to experience yourself as one continuous self, even though the structure generating that self is constantly changing. Another critical aspect of this realization is that identity is not anchored in a fixed core that remains unchanged, but in the brain's ability to generate coherence within the current state, meaning that what defines you is not a permanent essence, but the way in which the system organizes perception, memory, and awareness at any given moment. This explains why each configuration of identity can feel complete and authentic while it is active, even if it differs from other configurations. The inability to perceive the transitions between these configurations reinforces the illusion of permanence, because it prevents the detection of discontinuity and allows the brain to maintain a consistent sense of self without revealing the underlying changes. This creates a powerful perception that identity is stable, even though it is being continuously reconstructed. The broader implication is that the self is not something that exists independently of the brain's operation, but something that is produced by it, meaning that who you are is defined not by a single, unchanging identity, but by the current configuration of the processes that generate your experience. This makes identity inherently dynamic capable of shifting, adapting, and being replaced without requiring your awareness of those changes. By the end of this sequence, the final realization becomes clear. The you that feels constant is not something that persists unchanged, but something that is continuously rebuilt, moment by moment, state by state, through a process that you never fully observe, revealing that identity is not what remains the same, but what is repeatedly created in a way that feels like it has never changed. And this entire process happens every night, without interruption, without resistance, and without you ever seeing the moment when you stop being one version of yourself and become another. Act 8. Final reflection and what this means for you. When you take a step back and consider the entire sequence in its full scale, not just as isolated stages, but as a repeating pattern that happens every single night, the realization becomes more than a simple observation about sleep or dreaming. It becomes a direct reflection of how your mind operates at its deepest level, revealing that the identity you experience is not something that remains unchanged, but something that is continuously formed, dissolved, and reconstructed through processes that you never fully witness. This matters because it means that the sense of stability you rely on is not the absence of change, but the result of change happening in a way that remains hidden from your awareness. Every night, your brain begins to loosen the structure that defines who you are during the day, gradually reducing the systems that maintain your sense of continuity, your control over thought, and your connection to external reality. Not in a way that feels like loss, but in a way that feels natural, because the system responsible for recognizing that loss is part of what is being altered. And as this process continues, there is a point, a precise, irreversible threshold, where the identity you recognize is no longer the one organizing your experience. Yet you never perceive the exact moment when this happens, because crossing that point removes your ability to observe it. From there, your mind does not enter emptiness, but reconfigures itself into something else, generating a version of identity that feels complete within its own context, even though it is no longer anchored to your waking self, allowing you to exist, perceive, and respond within an internally generated reality that feels real while it is happening. This version of you does not question itself, does not compare itself, and does not attempt to return to who you were, because the conditions required for that comparison are no longer present, making the experience feel continuous even though it is fundamentally different. And then, without you ever seeing the transition, the process begins to reverse. The internally generated identity begins to dissolve as the brain reallocates its resources, gradually restoring the systems that define your waking self, reconstructing your memory, your sense of continuity, and your connection to reality in a way that feels seamless, even though it is the result of a complete reassembly. Once again, there is a critical moment, a second threshold, where your waking identity becomes stable enough to take over. Yet you do not perceive that moment either, because awareness only becomes fully aligned after the transition has already occurred. This creates two invisible points in every cycle. One where you stop being the person you were, and one where you become that person again. And you never see either of them. What you experience instead is a continuous narrative, a smooth and uninterrupted sense of self that feels like it has always been there. Because your brain fills in the gaps, reconstructs the continuity, and connects separate states into a single story that feels stable and consistent. This reconstruction is so effective that it hides the fact that your identity has been altered, replaced, and rebuilt, making it seem as though nothing has changed, but something has. Every night, Your mind proves that identity is not fixed. Every night it shows that the self you trust can be dissolved and replaced without resistance. Every night, it demonstrates that what feels permanent is actually conditional. And the most unsettling part is not that this happens, but that you never experience the exact moment when it does. Because if you could see that moment clearly, if you could remain aware as your identity dissolves and reforms, the illusion of a single unchanging self would no longer hold in the same way. And yet, the system is built so that you can't. You are always inside one version of yourself at a time. You are never present at the moment that version changes. And because of that, it always feels like you have been the same person all along. If you made it this far, like the video and subscribe for more deep explorations of the mind. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? And more importantly, if you could stay aware through that moment, would you still feel like the same person?